At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
I think about how easy it is to be overwhelmed by what's happening in the world right now. And it's so much easier for me to think, okay, you know what I want to do is just sort of turn on the scroll feature in my brain. I then have to remember, not only do I have all these feelings, but so does everyone. I think we have this impression that nobody else cares or sees what we see, but that's actually completely not the case. When you talk one-on-one to people, you realize, oh, everybody feels this way, or everybody is going through a loss or a grief or a great joy, you know?
Yeah. Welcome to The Stacks, a podcast about books and the people who read them. I'm your host, Tracy Thomas, and today I am joined by award-winning poet Ada Limón. Ada served as the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States. She was recognized as a 2024 Time Magazine Woman of the Year and was a finalist for the National Book Award. We're here today to talk about her brand new book, Against Breaking, on the Power of Poetry, which is a speech Ada delivered in April 2025 that explores the profound ability of poetry to heal, inspire, connect, and remind us of our shared humanity. Today, Ada and I talk about what surprised her during her tenure as the Poet Laureate, the ways that poems can connect us to our own feelings and the feelings of others, and why it's important that we engage with poetry even if we think we don't get it. Our book club pick for April is Room Swept Home by Remika Bingham Risher. We will be discussing that book on Wednesday, April 29th with Mahogany L. Brown. Everything we talk about on each episode of The Stacks is linked in our show notes. And if you like this podcast, if you want more bookish content and community, consider joining the Stacks Pack on Patreon and subscribing to my newsletter, Unstacked, on Substack. These are both places where you can get awesome bonus content like episodes and access to our Discord. And honestly, it's not that complicated. You know what Patreon and Substack are about. They are about supporting the creators that you love, making it possible for us to do this work every single week. So if you like the show, head to patreon.com/thestacks to join the Stacks Pack, and or head to my newsletter on Substack at tracythomas.substack.com. All right, now it is time for my conversation with Ada Limón. Okay, everybody, it is April. It is Poetry Month. And did you think we were going to do a Poetry Month where we didn't get to talk to everyone's favorite poet, Ada Limón? You'd be crazy if you thought that. I am so honored to have her here with us today to talk about her brand new book called Against Breaking, on the Power of Poetry. Ada, welcome to the Stacks.
Hey, it's great to be here, and it's really nice to see you again.
I know, I'm so happy. We got the pleasure of meeting in Texas at the Texas Book Festival where you were being honored. And instantly I was like, oh, I get the Ada Limón hype, because all of my favorite poets talk about you when they come on this podcast. And then the moment I met you, I was like, sure, this makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm so glad to have you. Why don't you tell the people what this book is?
Yes. Against Breaking, on the Power of Poetry is a book that is essentially the expanded version of the final talk that I gave during my final event at the Library of Congress. And I was serving as the Poet Laureate for 3 years. And really, you only have 2 obligations, and one of the first obligations is to do a public reading, which I had done in September of 2022. And the last obligation is to do a closing lecture. And so this book is the expanded version of the closing lecture that I gave in April of 2025 as my closing lecture as the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States.
Okay, before we get to what's in the book, you briefly in the introduction talk about this moment of getting this phone call and your friend's like, oh, you're going to get this like video call, maybe do your hair or whatever, which I love as a person who never does anything for video anymore. Is being the Poet Laureate something that you had wanted? Is that something that's even like on someone's bucket list, or is this just a thing that kind of like happens to you?
I mean, I think as poets, there is this idea that if you are very lucky and you have a long, storied, brilliant career, you may be asked at some point in your 70s or 80s. It was not something that I was hoping for, not something that was on my radar. If I thought about the poet laureate, I usually thought of more of our elder generational poets that I admire and love and who have been mentors. So I think that was part of the shock, was that it wasn't something I was expecting to do ever. And then,
Sure.
if I was asked, it certainly didn't expect to be asked in my 40s.
Okay, so then I guess that begs the follow-up question. Where does one go as a youthful poet laureate? Like what does that mean for you? Because if it's something that people do in their 70s and 80s, it sort of sounds like it's like a swan song. It's like, I'm the poet laureate, and then I kind of just tuck away. But I feel like, I hope I'm not speaking for you, I feel like you've got a lot of life to live, and you probably have a lot of things you want to do. So what does that mean for you now?
Well, the great thing about it is there have been people that have been mentors to me that have served as younger poets laureate, and including people like Tracy K. Smith and Natasha Trethewey. So I think about that a great deal, what they have gone on to do and the work that they have created. So for me, one of the gifts about serving is that you give yourself wholeheartedly into the project of service, to start thinking about what it is to give a bit of yourself to others, to the wider effort of literacy, the wider effort of poetry, to think larger and beyond yourself and your own artistic makings. And now, as I am still somewhat untangling from that incredible but very, very public position, I'm returning to myself as an artist. And I think that's been really beautiful. I'm still doing a lot of speaking and, of course, releasing books. But the best thing for me right now is to really take a moment of reflection and to remember what it is to make poems, and to remember what it is to be a real living, feeling, thinking person moving through this world, without necessarily the expectations that come with a larger public position.
What does that look like for you, like on more like a day-to-day level? Are there routines or rituals that you've like tapped back into? Are there things that you're doing to help you get back to yourself as an artist?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. In fact, I just came back from traveling yesterday. And one of the big things for me is to get back to nature. As you know, I'm a huge nature lover. In fact, I will be completely indulgent and tell you that I woke up early and I actually went bird watching for a good 2 hours before we even met together on this podcast.
I love it.
I think that's a big part of it, is letting myself observe and look and get a little lost, and just not always be making something or not always be putting something out, but also resting, receiving, refueling. And that's very important to me, I should say, as an artist, is to make sure that I have moments of real receiving, that I'm taking in the world, as opposed to always in being interested in the transformation or the output, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think that's actually a perfect way to get into the book, The Speech, because one of the things that I found really interesting is throughout the speech, you reference different poets, things that you think about. You know, you have a section early on where you talk about, when I'm thinking about starting something, I think about this poem. And when I'm thinking about finishing something, I'm thinking about this poem. And, you know, in this moment, I think about this poet. And one of the things you say is that you're in the reader and the writer of poetry are then sort of linked in these ways, right? That you're connected through the reading of someone else's poem. So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that, because that's sort of what it sounds like. The receiving that you're talking about is like receiving the work of others, receiving the offerings of others. And so I'd just love for you to say more.
Well, I love that you brought that up because I feel like it's very attuned to what you do in your work, which is that moment of recognizing what's important, right? That when we read something, it goes into our bloodstream, it goes into our life. And if it really matters to us, it stays there. It changes us. It is, our chemistry is different afterwards. Our minds are different afterwards. And one of the things that I love about your work is that you are constantly talking about what an impact a book can have on you. And I think that this book that I've made is really about celebrating that, but doing it as individual poems. I think oftentimes we think about the literary investment being the novel or the book or the nonfiction or, something that's quite large. But for poets, our poems travel one poem at a time. And so you can read one poem and be quite moved by it. And that goes into your whole body and changes you. And so when I'm in my receiving place and I'm reading, I'm deeply moved by certain lines. And if I'm really lucky, my brain retains them and holds on to them. And they become part of me for the rest of my life. I take them wherever I go. And that's something that I feel really lucky to have in my life. And I know that some people think about that when they think of prayers, or they think about that when they think about lyrics to songs or music. And poetry is like that for me, that I'm able to keep it in me and allow myself to be changed by it.
I love that you're saying this, because I do feel like poets are really good at remembering poems. Like when Tiana Clark came on the show last year, the whole episode is just her saying like, oh, and then when Jericho Brown said this, and then reciting like 8 lines of a poem. I'm like, how does she remember all of this? But I guess it must be something that's like in the heart of a poet. You are like in the same way that the musician will be like, oh, that was in the key of F. And I'm just like, how do you know that?
That's exactly right. And how a musician might remember all of the lyrics to a song that's not theirs, right? But that music influenced them, or those lyrics influence them. And so that's very much how we are, is that they stick with us because we embody them. And then they become part of not only our life, but also our work and the work that we make.
And in this sort of it becoming part of you and becoming part of the work that you make, there's sort of this invitation then to the reader, which is like, because I think, so I guess let me backtrack. In the book, in the beginning, you sort of talk about how as you're the poet laureate, you're going around the country, you're meeting people, and people are saying things to you. Some people are like, oh, I love poetry. I read poems all the time. Some people are like, oh, I secretly write poems. Some people, there's a story about someone's grandfather who had all these poems, and he like left the poems for each of the children when he died. Like that there are all these different ways that people are relating to poetry. And so I guess my first question there is like, did that surprise you?
It did surprise me. And it was such a gift, because I think that I had the mistaken idea that I was supposed to go into the world and tell people about poetry, in this public position. And then everyone just came up to me and said, let me tell you about my poems, or let me tell you about my poetry group, or the reading group, or the women's group that meets every Tuesday and we share a poem, I found it so thrilling because let me tell you, I just recently went on a birdwatching trip with the beautiful writer Amy Tan, and there was a group of us that went to go see the sandhill crane migration in Kearney, Nebraska. And the sandhill crane migration is 500,000 birds that are migrating. Whoa. And it's one of the largest avian migrations I think in the world that you can witness. And it's really moving. And here I was on the final day of being able to see the sandhill cranes before we left. And one of our guides came up and said, I heard you were a poet. And I just said, oh, yeah, I'm a poet. And she said, I'm a poet too. And the first poem I ever got published was about watching the sandhill cranes. And here she was, this nature guide who comes down from Alaska to volunteer so that she's able to not only witness again this migration, but help people witness it themselves. And then here she was in this bird blind as the sun comes up. And what were we talking about? We were talking about poems. And so I feel like many people think, oh, it's an art form that no one does anymore. But I feel as if wherever I go, someone's coming up to me and sharing their stories about poems that they read, poems that they love, or poems that they're making.
Yeah. Why do you think that we think that nobody's doing poems? Like, what's the disconnect? If everyone's doing poems, why is the line that like nobody's doing poems?
I think that it's really difficult to measure. I think when we talk about reading and the reading studies that have come out, which are pretty brutal, which shows that Americans are not reading, and yet I just think that we read one poem at a time. Sometimes we read them on the subway. Sometimes we read them on Instagram. Sometimes we read them on social media platforms and blog posts, and they're not, you can't measure them. And so I think that that's part of that misnomer. I also think that there's a lot of people that write poems that are secret poets and they don't want to tell people about it. And it's what they do to heal. I think that sometimes there are people that feel very seriously connected to poetry and in a very authentic academic way, maybe hold up the expert craft element of making a poem, which is beautiful and useful. But I think that we can't lose sight of the fact that a poem that is just to heal your heart or to get you through the day, even if it's writing in your journal or putting it in your, in the drawer in your desk, never to be seen again, that's still a useful thing. That it's still something that can help you. I mean, don't you think we need all the tools we could possibly have right now to get through this chaos of this moment?
Yes. I want to get to these tools because you talk about it in the book. But before we do, I'm going to just share with you, I think maybe we talked about this in person, but I'm going to share with you my relationship to poetry because it has been years in the making. So when I first started the show, I did not read poems very much at all. I was a theater major, so we had to do a poem for voice and speech class, and everyone got assigned all these like very fancy poems. And I was assigned The Owl and the Pussycat. So I was a little bit offended that my teacher gave me this like silly poem. It was great, and I did a great job. I got an A in that class, but I've always sort of been a little like whatever about poetry. And in 2020, I believe, I posted my like best books of the year. And there were no poetry collections in it, my 10 best. And Reginald Dwayne Betts sent me a message and was like, you should read poems. And I was like, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know how to do that. I don't know poems. I don't understand poems. And to get on a microphone publicly and sound like an idiot is not necessarily something that I want to do. Like I have done it. I do it a lot, but it's like not intentional. And he was like, I will come on the show and we will do a poetry collection. And I said, you know what? That sounds great. So that was in 2021. And we did Jericho Brown's The Tradition. And I didn't understand not a single poem. But we did it, and Reginald was great. And I said, you know what? Every year we're going to do poetry in April for Poetry Month. Like that's when people are thinking about poetry. And I made friendships with some great poets. And every person told me, if you just like one or two poems in a collection, that collection is a success. And that was very hard for me to understand. And in almost every episode, maybe until last year, I would preface it with like, I don't know anything about poems. I don't understand poetry, whatever. But as I started to read more poetry, as I started to think about poems more, I'm realizing that a lot of this poetry was ruined for me before I even got a chance to really read it in school. Like I think it was Nate Marshall who was like, Tracy, poems are not math equations. And I was like, no, I didn't know that, actually. I thought there was an answer. I thought there was something that I was supposed to get out of a poem. And if I didn't get it, that I had failed as a reader. And so I think one of the things that now my relationship to poetry is I'm a person who has like 7 or 8 poems on my phone just saved that I love, that I go and read. Like I read Ellen Bass's The Thing Is at least once a week. I love that
Beautiful
poem so much.
poem.
I love it so much. I
It's
love it so much.
amazing.
And then I finally read her collection, Mules of Love. Is that what it's called? It's incredible. I love every poem. I love that collection. But it started with me reading The Thing Is at least 20 times on my phone over the course of like half of a year before I actually got the collection and read it and loved it. And so all of this is to say that I feel like it's true that it's hard to measure how people are reading poems, but I also think fundamentally people who do not feel the call to read poems, who feel like the pressure to read poems, we've been done a disservice previously in our relationship to poetry. Like that we have been told or felt like we've been told that there's a right way to poem, and it's not true.
It's not true. It's not true. And as much as I love collections of poetry, I love individual books. I always tell people if you are new to poetry in general, you should probably start with anthologies so that you can skip around and read a poem that you like, and or read a poem you don't like and skip it. You know, I always say that if you're driving in your car and you are listening to the radio and you don't like a song, you turn the channel.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you don't like music.
Right.
Like you are going to dislike some poetry. Like that is the other part I think that people are concerned about, is that they think I didn't like that one poem by Robert Frost, so I don't like poetry. We assume one thing is the whole thing. And poetry is as different as songs are, individual songs. And so you might love one poem by one artist, and then you might not like the other poem by the same artist.
Right.
So
Wait,
I
can
think
I ask you this?
That's important. Yeah, go ahead, please.
My follow-up question is then, for me, when I don't like a poem, I assume that I didn't get it. Whereas when I don't like a book or I don't like music, I feel like I have the vocabulary to say why.
Yeah.
I didn't like this book because I felt like the character development was not there. It was really flat. Or I didn't like this song because her voice sounded bad. Like she didn't have the range, whatever it is. But with poems, if it's like, this is Robert Frost, I'm like, oh, well, it's Robert Frost. It must be me. So how do people develop the skill to feel confident enough to not like something and know that like it's just a taste thing, and not to feel like they're a failure?
Well, sometimes it is just a taste thing, and sometimes that's okay. And there are sometimes also there where you may not get it. I mean, I think that for years I was really put off by John Ashbery. I thought that was a poet that I had no interest in reading. It seemed unnecessarily complex. It felt like it was purposely obfuscating the point. And then as I aged and developed as a human being and as a poet, I really took my time and read his work, and then I fell in love with it. So I think there are poems that you may not like at certain moments in your life, and they may not mean something for you at that time. There are also poems that we're speeding through because we may think, you know what, I want to read a poem, and then we're just going to read it really fast. And we okay. Yeah. It didn't do anything for me. But then you might be sitting somewhere and someone goes, oh, you don't like that poem? And you go, oh, it never did anything to me. And then they go, let me read it to you. And then you go, oh. And then they read it to you and you go, oh. And then you go home and you read it aloud and you go, oh. Because that's the other thing. Poetry is really meant to be out loud. And so you absorb it with the music. And sometimes, and I once heard Arthur Z., our current poet laureate, talk about this, which was that he was writing these beautiful lyric poems and he was reading them at the Dodge Poetry Festival. And he said, if you don't know what's happening, and you're looking for a story to hold on to, and you're looking for something to grasp. He's like, I just want you to think of this as music. I want you to listen to it and let your mind wander and let the images wash over you and the music of the poems wash over you. But don't keep trying to grasp onto something as if you are reading it like a paragraph or hearing it like a paragraph. So a lot of times it's just releasing, and you're starting to listen to the ideas of your own self, your own body, and how it responds to the poem. So I think that a lot of times if we dislike a poem, it might be at that moment in time. It's not the poem we're supposed to read. It might be that it is too difficult for us and that it needs to be read aloud and then read aloud again and then read aloud again. And by the fourth reading, you think, how did I ever live without this poem? So it's, I think it's, I want to grant every new reader of poetry to just love one poem for a little while. And then you might look up that poet and go, well, who do they like? And then you think, okay, maybe I'll read that other poem. And then you think, oh, maybe not this one. And then you'll find one and go, oh yeah, this is a good one. And I think that it can be difficult when we feel as if we have to like every poem that was ever written by anyone in order to call ourselves poetry fans. You can like one poem and be a fan of poetry.
Right. Okay, I want to ask you one more thing about reading poems out loud. I like to get a lot of poets on the record with this one.
Yeah.
What is your relationship to the end of the line and to the punctuation, and how do you navigate that when you're reading a poem out loud?
Yeah. I used to not read the line breaks when I was first starting out as a poet in graduate school. I thought the point was to pay more attention to the punctuation and to the period. And then I was taught really brilliantly by many different mentors, including Colleen McElroy and Mark Doty and Marie Howe. And there was a moment when I realized that the unit of poetry is really first the sound, and then the word, and then the clause, and then the line, then the sentence. And so I notice the line break, and I try not to pause in a really strong way, but there's a slight moment where anything could happen. And I hold that.
I love this.
I hold that in me. So it's like, oh, I don't know where it's going.
Yes.
And this is the surprise of the line break.
I knew I liked you because you agree with me. I studied Shakespeare, and
I love Shakespeare.
The line is so important in Shakespeare, more important than the punctuation oftentimes, or at least equally important. And so when I started reading poetry on this show, and I was always like trying to acknowledge the line ending, because it's like, otherwise, why is it there, right? Why would you end, especially if you're not working within like a very intense structure, right? Like it makes sense if you're doing iambic pentameter that you might have to kind of make it fit. But if you're just writing a poem, it's like, well, why would there be a line ending if it didn't mean something? And so many poets, even when they read their own poems, they ignore the line ending. And I'm so fascinated by this. And when I started asking poets about this, some of them were like, yeah, no, I don't. And doesn't make sense in my brain. I'm like, if it's a line ending, I'm going to do something. And I tell people all the time, it doesn't mean you stop. Sometimes it just means you just like you said, notice it.
We know it's there.
It.
Yeah.
It's there. Well, you can't make it not there. So you have to at least reckon with it when you're reading it out loud.
And the way I write my poems, I'm very interested in line breaks. They do mean something to me. There is a slight acknowledgement because that's the tension. Poetry really exists in the tension between the line break and the sentence. And I also was raised on Shakespeare. I was also a theater major. And
I know this.
And so Shakespeare was really the first poet I got to know. And so that's exactly the same way. And if you think about iambic pentameter is that speech. So it's meant to read like speech. And so when you are then making a smaller, shorter line, that's a more internal line. And that allows for more space, more breath, more pauses.
Yeah.
And it tends to be a little more meditative and quiet. And then when you have a longer line than Shakespeare and you go, further, then it's more public, it's more chatty, it moves much faster. And so the length of the line is actually supposed to give us the speed
Right.
of how we're reading it. And
Right.
so iambic pentameter is supposed to mimic speech, which
Right.
is how Shakespeare wrote almost everything.
Right, exactly. And I feel like just when I'm reading poem, like, sometimes you'll have a poem and it'll be shaped interesting on the page, like a pyramid, or, someone will do something, the
Yeah.
words will be spread out all across.
Mhm.
And I'm always reading those, trying to figure out, maybe there's not a right answer, but I'm trying to make meaning of that choice. Especially if I'm reading someone's collection
Mhm.
and there's 50 poems and there's only one poem that's in the shape of a pyramid. I'm thinking like the pyramid's got to mean something.
It does. Yeah.
And I think like for me, that's always really fun as I'm reading poetry, because even if I don't like the poem, or even if I'm not really even paying attention to the poem, I'm paying attention to it in different ways. And I think that's really exciting. And so I do get frustrated when a poet's like, oh, I don't think about that. I'm like,
Yeah.
what do you mean? I've been spending
Yeah.
45 minutes on this pyramid poem.
I totally agree. And I think there are times where poets will say, oh, that's not how I'm working, or that's not what my intention was, which is totally fair, right? We should listen to the artist and listen to what they have to offer. And if we're reading and spending time with their work, our efforts in that endeavor should also be taken into consideration. And one of the things I find fascinating is that critics of poetry, and I mean criticism in the best way, the scholars of poetry, we're thinking about the tradition of poetry and where all poetry comes from, and that it's in conversation with all other poets. And so a poet might say, oh, that's not how line breaks work for me. But that is how line breaks work.
Yeah. Correct.
So they may not see that, right?
Right.
Even when they're making it, they may not see that. It's similar to if you say a musician that says, oh, I was never thinking about Joni Mitchell when I wrote this, really highly lyrical song with a lot of musical notes in one bar, et cetera, et cetera. But we may know that is the influence of music on this artist. So I think that's how I would think of it. Yeah.
Right. Okay, let's take a quick break, and then I want to talk about the tools that we teased earlier. Guess what April is? It's the Stacks anniversary month. That's right. We are officially 8 years old this month, which, what? How can that even be possible? That I have been talking into this very microphone for 8 years straight with all of you. I love it. It is one of the great joys of my life, and I could not do it without the support of people. Listening to this independent podcast every week goes such a long way. And if you want to go the extra mile, consider supporting us on Patreon and Substack as well. In both of these spaces, if you join on a paid tier, you make it possible for me to make this podcast every single week, and you earn perks for yourself. Over on Patreon, you can come to our book club meetups, which are a hoot. You can join in our very active private Discord channel. You can be part of our annual mega reading challenge, which helps you diversify and broaden your reading life. Plus, you get an exclusive bonus episode every month. Over on Substack, you get that same bonus episode. Plus, you get all of my hot takes when you read my newsletter Unstacked. Making this podcast takes an entire village. I do mean that. As an independent creator, I could not make this show without the support of my Patreon and my Substack subscribers. You all allow me and my team to do the work that we love. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you or your friends are looking to meet other book lovers and support an independent podcast, come hang out with me on Patreon at patreon.com/thestacks and subscribe to my newsletter at tracythomas.substack.com. When I started the Stacks, I quickly learned there was a lot more to having my own business than talking to authors and reading a lot of books. There were scripts to be written, episodes to be scheduled, logos to create, social media to manage, and you know what? That's just the tip of the iceberg. This list was endless. It felt like I was spending more time sorting through logistics than reading books. When you're starting your own business, it helps to have a tool that can simplify everything so you can focus on what matters most. That's why I want to introduce you all to Shopify. Shopify makes starting your own business feel seamless with hundreds of ready-to-use templates to build your brand identity, AI tools to help you write copy and enhance images, and built-in marketing tools to create bespoke email and social campaigns and reach even more people. The best part is you can manage all your tasks in one place, making your life easier and your business operations way more efficient. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, from household names to startups. Want to add your name to the list? Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Sign up for your $1 per month monthly trial today at shopify.com/thestacks. Go to shopify.com/thestacks. That's shopify.com/thestacks. As you all know, 2026 is sort of becoming my year of comfort. I have worked up all these different excuses to prioritize self-care and relaxation. Mother's Day is on the horizon, so I'm already planning my Sunday. But there has been no better way to make my comfy dreams come true than with Cozy Earth. From stepping out of bed in the morning to unwinding after a long day, Cozy Earth has been my key to achieving all of my softness and comfort goals. When I wake up in the morning, I feel like an actual princess when I get to step out of bed and slide my feet into my Cozy Earth slippers. They are warm, they are snug, and also they're amazing at the end of the day when I finally take off my shoes and I just am moseying around the house. They make me feel like a fancy person who has my stuff together. And because comfort should be long-lasting, your purchase is backed by a 10-year warranty that protects against damage for an entire decade. That leaves you with zero risk and all of the reward. Head to CozyEarth.com and use my code THESTACKS for an exclusive 20% off your purchase. And if you see a post-purchase survey, can you be sure to mention that you heard about Cozy Earth right here on The Stacks? Whether you're looking to show yourself a little extra love and care, maybe you're on the hunt for the perfect Mother's Day gift, Cozy Earth has the products and the comfort and the care that you and your mom and the moms in your life deserve. Okay, we are back. I want to talk about the tools because as you go into your speech, you sort of start at this place of, poems are everywhere. And then there's this moment where you sort of are like, I got to be honest. Sometimes I don't want to read poems and I don't want to write poems because I don't want to feel.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the first moment where you really bring this idea of feeling as sort of what poems for you are about, I feel, or like what the center of the poem is doing, whether you like it or not. That poems are about feeling something from another person, that the poet has offered this to you. And as the reader, you in turn are to feel something. And as we continue in the collection, you sort of talk about how poetry, that this ability to feel is important right now, that it is useful right now. Will you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for bringing that up. I think about it a lot because I know myself. Which turns out it's the only real person I know is just myself. But I think a great deal about how easy it is to be overwhelmed by what's happening in the world right now. Careening from one crisis to another, feeling this sense of chaos, feeling the sense of an untetheredness to the world. And it's so much easier for me to think, okay, what I want to do is just sort of turn on the scroll feature in my brain and just go and scroll through things. Look at, social media and just sort of numb out, not feel anything. Don't even stop on anything, right? Just go, okay, next. And I understand that, that's not that dissimilar to wanting to drink, a bottle of wine. Or, wanting to feed oneself into oblivion, all those things. I have all those feelings sometimes, which is how do I stop myself from feeling? And yet, in order to gather courage, in order to be brave and go into the world and to face this moment, which I believe we are all in some ways meant to be here at this moment, I then have to remember that not only am I a feeling person, not only do I have all these feelings, but so does everyone. Yeah. And I think sometimes when we are numbing out, we have this impression that nobody else cares or sees what we see or is going through what we're going through. But that's actually completely not the case. When you talk one-on-one to people, when you read, you realize, oh, everybody feels this way, or everybody is going through a loss or a grief or a great joy, and I think that that's very easily forgotten these days because we numb out to protect ourselves, which is completely, it's not unusual. It's how we, in some ways, stay safe. And, poetry is not always the safe place. Poetry is often meant to ignite us and turn us on to the world and wake us up. And just remember that we are living beings. And at some point, all of us, no matter who we are, will eventually die and we will lose everything we love. And that loss that is inevitable is a huge part of appreciating this world.
In the book, you talk about this poem about like praising. It's called "Try to Praise the Mutilated World," and it was, you were reading it after September 11th on the subway in the New Yorker, and you say you just imagine that everybody else was reading it too, which I love. Yeah. But what you say about the poem, I'm just going to read this a little bit. It says, "It wasn't just the poem itself or the instructions it insisted upon, but the way it reminded me that language had power, and it could have power for good. We need a secular, sacred language, something that is galvanizing without certainty, that gathers us without gathering under one ruler, but under the connection that we all have to the human spirit, to each other, to the earth." I love this.
Thank you.
This little bit to me felt like, aha, the thesis of the thing. Like this really felt like the heart of the speech, that we need this language, that we need poetry because it is doing something, it is offering something that maybe perhaps prose cannot. And you get at this at the end of the speech, you say like, I'm writing in prose, but I need to be writing in poetry. Like you're like, it's like that. I was thinking of it as far as like the theater, like a play versus a musical. They say like when things get really heightened in a musical, that's when the singing starts, right? And I was thinking about that as like poetry is the like jacked up on feeling steroid version of prose. Like it's like prose intense. But I guess what I want to know is like, what is it about poetry that you feel like can galvanize us? What is it about this use of the language versus prose? Because I think so many people would say they're more comfortable with prose. So why do you think poetry can unlock this for us?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's in the music. I think that there is a music and a rhythm. And I mean, every poem is different, but poetry can do this, which is tap into that musicality that feels like human breath, that it feels like we have to lean into it to listen to it. It could feel incantatory. It can feel as if suddenly there is not just a sense making, which prose is focused on, a sense making, right? We're reading for meaning, but there is an emotional impact, that there is an unlocking of feeling. And I think that's the key to poetry, is that you are supposed to open up. There's a reason why when you go to poetry readings, people cry. You know, I go to poetry, I cry at poetry readings all the time. And I think that it's sometimes not at what was supposed to be a sad poem. Sometimes it's the beautiful poem, the one that just says something so good. And you think, yeah, okay, human kindness. Yes, I missed it. I've been missing it. And then you hear a poem and you go, yeah, oh, I needed to be reminded of that. And so it is that idea of not just sense making, but the idea of unlocking our feelings and reminding us that we live in the feelings as well. Right. And I think that there's so many of us that think in order to get out of a moment, whatever it may be, in order to untangle us from the mess we've made as humankind, we have to engage solely our intellect. And the poet's job is to engage the intellect, yes, but it's also to engage the heart. It's to engage the soul. And in that sense, I find it could be more unifying. When everyone's in a room listening to a poem, there's something that shifts, that feels different than prose. And I read often, and there are times where I'm talking about the poem, or I'm telling a story or something, and then I read the poem. And those two events for me feel entirely different when I'm reading the audience. There is one that feels like conversation. It's welcoming. We're in a moment. And then the poem happens, and the happening of the poem feels as if we've entered a musicality of the heart. And that is entirely different than the prose realm.
Right. That's so interesting. I don't know that I feel that when I listen to a poem, but I also feel like I have so many other things around poetry, like so many insecurities, that it like gets in the way of me being open to the feeling. Do you know what I mean?
I do. Yeah. Let me tell you this story. I had this one when I was serving as poet laureate. I had this one woman said, "I'm so sorry. I missed your whole poem about the raincoat poem." She said, the one that where your mom is driving you to an appointment, and she said, "I just missed the ending because I started thinking about my mom and how my mom used to take me to these lessons to help me with my speech therapy. And she never said anything, and she would just take me and she would sit outside the room to make sure I felt safe, and I would do my speech therapy." And, this woman's telling me this whole thing. She's like, "So I'm so sorry because I didn't get the poem and I missed it." And I kept thinking, no, that's exactly what that poem was supposed to do. You just had such an authentic experience with a poem, which is that you got 3 lines in, and your brain and your heart made you time travel. It unearthed a memory. Like, that's magical. That to me is the best kind of success, is that someone was moved to re-experience something in their own lives because of 3 lines that they think they missed. But in reality, it entered them back into the world.
Okay. This is making me think of something else. In today's day and age where we have these like issues with poetry, let's just say some of us, and where the poet is not like I feel like in the olden days, the poet was like, oh, the well-regarded poet. And now I feel like people are like, oh, I secretly write poems. Like, it doesn't have the same regard as maybe it once did. I feel like poets, and maybe this is, and professional poets, people who are public poets, people who write poetry and want to talk about it, as opposed to the secret poet, are so generous with their readers or listeners, like what you're saying, you're telling this story and you're like, no, you got it. Like that is what the poem is supposed to do. I'm wondering, do you think this is something that is inherent in today's modern day poet, or is this something you've had to learn, like this graciousness with the consumer of the poetry? Because I think of like people who write fiction and someone will be like, oh, this is what I got. And they'll be like, no. And it's just like a very like, no, that's not right. You did not get that. Like, in a way that can be, or like sometimes, someone will put a review on Goodreads and then the author will come back and be like, well, that's not what I was doing or whatever. And I've never heard a poet say that in the years I've been doing this. Usually a poet's like, I love that you got that, or that's so interesting. I wasn't thinking of that, but that's such a, like, so do you think that's just the poet spirit, or do you think that's something you all have learned because people are just like, you're just like, please think about poems. I don't care what you get out of it. Just like think about poems.
Yeah, I do think there is part of us that feels like if you've taken a moment to read anything, we're gracious about it and grateful for it. But I don't think that's everyone. I think there is a lot of really wonderful poets that are interested in writing for other poets. And I think that's also a beautiful thing, right? Yeah. That's like the incredibly talented jazz musician who wants to write or wants to make music for the other incredibly talented jazz musicians in the room.
Yes.
And they are talking to each other, and it's a gift that we get to witness it. Right?
Yes. Okay.
And they're not going to look at us and be like, oh, let me spoon feed you this, right? Like this. Yeah. So I think there are some poets that are like that. And I think there's a part of me that feels that way sometimes, which is just like, if you don't get it, that's fine. You don't read it, But I also feel like very early on, I wanted to be a poet that wrote for non-poets.
Right.
I always have been. I have my life is full of non-poets, as most people's lives are. And I think I would feel sad if I only wrote for other poets. And I love other poets. And my favorite thing is to, have a cocktail and sit around at a poetry table and just nerd out about line breaks and what we're reading and all of these things. And, to talk about the great poets of the past, all those things. But that is not every day for me, Every day for me is spent with people who struggle with poetry. And, for me, it's important to offer a way in,
Yeah.
Someone once said, I don't like poetry, but I really like your poetry. And I said something like, well, I'll be your gateway drug.
Yes, that's so true. I guess that's true. Also, even my question is like so biased because all the poetry that I read and all the poems that I've talked about and all the poets that I know are poets who I think are deeply concerned with poetry for non-poets and like this experiment of like, or not experiment, but this like effort to bring us in. Like I'm thinking of like Jose Olivares, like I think he would say that he is interested in poems for non-poets. And I 100%. Think, his work. And so I think maybe that's also why these are the poets that I feel like are so generous with me and with others, because they're like, the fact that you're here is a affirmation of the work that I do.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that there are a lot of people and really wonderful poets who that's not their endeavor. They're and that's a beautiful thing too, And I think that we need all of us.
Yes, I agree. I'm now realizing as you're saying this, like, of course, I would never read a poem by a poet for other poets. And
they might not come on. Too.
And they don't want me. Yeah, exactly. They don't want me and I don't want them. Like maybe one day I'll get there, right? Like we read Toni Morrison every year. And we just finished our 9th Toni Morrison novel for the show. And now I'm like, oh, even the hard ones, I feel like I'm getting it. But in the beginning, I was like, there's no way I can read, like Beloved, I can barely get through Sula. Like I am struggling. And so I do feel like, the more that I read poetry, the more confident I feel and the more likely that I could maybe dip my toe into the Poets for Poets community. But I feel so much better in the poems for the regular world.
Yeah. And I think that there are poets, and I hope they always exist. I hope they always exist,
Yes.
That are the welcomers, that stand there and say, come on in, Come on. It's not scary. It's not scary.
We need you guys don't ever leave us.
Yeah. And then, and then there are the poets that are like, no, this is scary.
Right.
And it should be scary. And, Toni Morrison's actually a perfect example of that, of the work that when you read it and spend time in it and then do it again, you think, oh, it might have taken the third reading.
Yes.
I remember that experience with her when I was first reading her, like in high school. I thought, I'm never gonna get this. Yeah. And she of course is one of my favorite all-time writers.
Right. That's how I feel too. I was so intimidated. And it has been a similar journey for me as with reading poetry of just like, okay, I didn't get that. Like, I'm not going to spend an hour berating myself because I'm confused about who this person is. I'm just going to keep going. And then when I get to the end, I can reflect and I can always go back and I do feel like that kind of generosity with oneself is a really useful tool to sort of cultivate when reading Toni Morrison or James Baldwin or poetry. Or even like watching a movie, I think a lot of this stuff. And I don't know, for some reason, I feel like I'm just so much more kind to myself in all other forms of reading and art consuming than I am with poetry. And then like going to the art museum, that's even harder for me than poetry. That's the one where I'm like, I don't get it. I hate it here. Like, I gotta go. I gotta get out of this room.
Yeah. And people know themselves, right? The thing that you kind of feel, as if you don't belong there. Right. And I think that there's a lot of people who feel that way about the visual arts. Sometimes they're like, I like a photograph, I don't like a painting, or, that to me I find that really interesting. And I think we should have those discussions, because to me, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So what is it about the photograph, but not the painting of the, I don't know, like that's fascinating. So to me, it's an interesting conversation starter. And I think, for some people, they really feel as if poetry has failed them. Mm-hmm. And because they've tried. And I get that. And I get that too. And I think it's okay to not like it. It really is. Right. There are people that don't like music. There are literal people that don't listen to music. So, but I for one think that the more we expand our minds and have these great conversations and open up to possibilities of poems and the possibilities of different art forms, the better we are as a species. I think it's part of our evolution. And, as we focus on the real dangers of artificial intelligence, poetry is so deeply human that as well as art making is so deeply human that I think, we need to make sure that it flourishes and remains and keeps that part of us alive that wants to speak back to the world in a real, authentic way.
And I think, and you talk about this very briefly in the book, and I think you should write a whole book about this, actually, is about this like confrontation between AI and poetry. Mm-hmm. And I think it's true for AI and art in general. And I think that in some ways, this is like, if we think of it in sort of war language, this battle between the artist and the artificial intelligence it's so interesting to think of like poets and painters and singers and whatever as being on the front lines in a certain way. But I do feel like that because, as you say in the book, like people want to know if AI can write a poem because writing a poem is so like human. So can AI be human? And I thought that was so interesting. Before we get out of here, there's a few questions I have to ask you, which is one, how do you like to write? How many hours a day? How often do you listen to music? Are you in your home? Are you out somewhere else? Are there snacks and beverages? Talk about it.
Well, I love to write at home. And ideally, because I'm a California girl, I like to write outside.
Okay.
For me, I like to have a hydration station is what I call it, which is like all the different beverages.
Okay, like coffee,
what are they? Black coffee, water, and then kombucha usually,
Okay.
like a
Okay.
kombucha. And then I like to just have, sometimes I bring out some books for inspiration. And then I have a journal that I write in every single day. Now the journal sometimes is just ends up to be a to-do list because it's that kind of day. And I
Right.
allow that to exist, but it also has my dreams in it. It has the things that I need to do. And then it also has lists of things that I'm interested in. Sometimes it has lists of species of birds I've seen. But so oftentimes when I do have a moment to sit down and have a concentrated writing time, I turn to the journal and I think, oh, there's all this stuff here that I've been working on. And so it's sometimes there's whole lines of poems. Sometimes there's whole drafts of poems in there. So I write a lot longhand. And then eventually, as I get my draft together, it goes to the computer for more of an editorial perusal.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the case. And then, because I'm on the road quite a bit and I speak at a lot of different universities, and which is just a joy. And also am lucky enough to have, Against Breaking is actually my 11th book in the world. But I have trained myself to be able to write on planes, and in hotel rooms and pretty much anywhere. The big thing for me, I love music. I love it. I love it. I cannot listen to it while writing.
Yeah.
I think I'm a mimic, and maybe a mimic and a magpie. I look for shiny objects. It's all I can hear. And
Right.
what I am looking for when I'm writing a poem is to somehow unearth my own music, the music that's been moving through me.
Right.
And I need to hear not only the voice and the voice underneath the voice, but also how it echoes back and that music that it's making. So no, I can't listen to music.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
In the book, you say you've been to almost every state. What states have you still not been to?
North Dakota, South Dakota, and Alaska.
That's it. Just 3.
Yeah.
I love it.
But I'm hoping to get to Alaska this year. I got this beautiful invitation from North Dakota, and I really wish I could have gone, but it was right on the heels of something else, and I physically couldn't swing it.
Yeah.
But no, I would love to go to all 3 of those places at some point, and read poems.
Okay, this is the last thing I want to ask you about. In the book, towards the end, you talk about the poem on the Statue of Liberty. You talk about these like public poems and how, the lines in that poem we all know, or many of us know, or at least some of them. We at least know give us our, I don't know it, but give us your weary, So I was thinking about that. What are other public poems that we know? Because I was thinking about how public poems and your whole project, the You Are Here poetry collection, and you went out to these national parks and you put poems in the parks. And I was thinking a lot about how if you are not confronted with a poem in your everyday life, whether that's Instagram or maybe a public poem, people might not ever think about poems, or they might not ever know how to find a poem because they're not going to buy a collection, or they're not going to go to the bookstore or the library. And so I was just thinking, like, what are other poems that we know from just like out in the world?
Yeah. I think one of the best examples is in New York City, and also in different cities, is Poetry in Motion. So that you encounter a poem on a subway,
right?
They're written, and that it's in the poster, or you have on the bus. And I feel like that's actually really always a wonderful moment where you see something and you think, oh, I'm thinking about something else. And then you read it and you realize you've read it before. And then you, oh, I really love this. I think that's an example of the public encounter with poetry, which is what I was hoping to do with the Parks program, is so that someone could have that kind of Parks experience, but then also read a poem and then think about maybe writing their own response to the natural world. I also think of inaugural poets. I think of Amanda Gorman and Richard Blanco and Elizabeth Alexander and all those wonderful poets that did the incredibly seriously hard work of creating an occasional poem for a
Right.
presidential inauguration, which I think is just massively difficult. So that's another example.
If I become president, will you write my inaugural poem?
Okay, here and now, I will say yes.
Okay. Well, if I become president and then you don't do it, I'm going to be so mad. I'm going to be
I'm
like,
here
wait,
for it.
I became president and then Ada said she wouldn't do it anymore.
We will shake virtually.
Yes. Okay. Deal. Okay. I have two more questions. One is for people who love Against Breaking. What are some other books that you might recommend to them that are in conversation with what you've created?
Oh, yes. There's a new book by Tracy K. Smith called Fear Less, and it's a little more craft heavy about poetry, but it's beautiful and brilliant. And of course, anything by Tracy K. Smith is just marvelous. I would also say the book Matthew Zapruder, Why Poetry, a little longer. And one of the things that I think is really beautiful about that is he goes through and dissects other poems, which is really wonderful.
That's so cool.
And then I would also say the very small and lovely book called Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which is about creating a gift economy and taking lessons from nature. So I would say those books just off the top of my head.
I love it. Okay, last one. If you could have one person, dead or alive, read the book, who would you want it to be?
Oh, wow. You know, this is just going to be a personal one, which
That's
is
great.
my teacher and really one of my first mentors, Colleen McElroy, who passed away a couple of years ago in Seattle. I would love for her to read it because she knew me as this young 19-year-old, 20-year-old who barely knew how to write a poem. And she taught me so much about not just making poems, but how to really appreciate poetry and read it in a way that I had never really thought about before. And so she was my teacher as an undergraduate, and I think about her often.
I love that. Thank you so much. Ada, thank you for being here. Thank you for offering this book to us. And I just love you. Thank you. I can't wait to be president. It's gonna be
Yay. I
great.
can't wait to read a poem at your inauguration.
I'm going to become president just for inauguration day. And then I'm going to be like, you know what? I got to resign. I got the poem. I'm done. It's too much work. I don't want this job.
No, we need you. You have to stay.
Thank you so much. Thank
you. Thank you for all the work you do. And it was such a delight to see you again.
You too. And everyone else, we will see you in the stacks. Thank you all so much for listening, and thank you again to Ada Limón. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to Ellie Crowley and Vaughn Fielder for helping to make this episode possible. Our book club pick for April is Room Swept Home by Remika Bingham Risher, which we will be discussing on Wednesday, April 29th with Mahogany L. Brown. If you love The Stacks, if you want inside access to it, head to patreon.com/The Stacks to join the Stacks Pack and subscribe to my newsletter at tracythomas.substack.com. Make sure you're subscribed to The Stacks wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're listening through Apple Podcasts or Spotify, will you take a moment to leave us a rating and a review? I know it seems like nothing, but it's actually a great way for new listeners to find the show and understand what they're getting with each episode. For more from The Stacks, follow us on social media at The Stacks Pod on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube. And you can always check out our website at thestackspodcast.com. This episode of The Stacks was edited by Christian Duenas with production assistance from Sahara Clement. Additional support was provided by Sheree Marquez, and our theme music is from Tigirigis. The Stacks is created and produced by me, Tracy Thomas.
At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.